the topic of the moment, war in Ukraine. So, I've got a little bit of reflection on what's going on there with the economic war that the, the Western powers somehow represent 17% of the world's population, 17% of the countries in the world, 17% are deciding for 83%. And has America not made a catastrophic mistake by declaring an economic war on Russia? That's the question. Here's why I believe that America has made a catastrophic mistake with their decision to seize all Russian assets, to block all the Russian money from their central bank, all the dollars. Well, that news has sent information to potential American opposition or America enemies such as China, India, and even the Arab countries who are very skeptical with America. This is certainly the beginning of the end of the dollar. You might not see it yet, you might not feel it yet, but it's happening. As they say, this is downloading in progress. Why? Because the dollar, through this war, one thing that this war has shown for sure is that the dollar is like this. It's like a coin. It's like a coin where you have two faces. At the front there, you have the word dollar. When you turn it around, you've got sanctions. So the rest of the world has realized that this currency that they've been using, patronizing and brandishing through history since World War II, that currency is poison, can become poisonous, and no one wants to be handling poison. So what they're going to do is to start getting rid of the dollar. So every single country in the world, for their best interest, especially the powerful countries in the world, for their best interest, it is necessary to get rid of the dollar. Because if they happen to have a problem with Americans' policy, the first thing America will do is to put sanctions. The funny thing is, who has ever put sanctions in the West? They say that they have common values. They say that they have common purpose. They say that they have democracy, freedom. But when America did something wrong in Libya, who in the West dared to put sanctions on America? Nobody. America invaded Iraq under false pretexts. Who did put sanction, impose sanction on America? Nobody. In fact, as for Iraq or Afghanistan, it was reported that the American leadership has clearly indicated that nobody should be allowed to investigate any wrongdoing by American soldiers in the war there. That anybody attempting to investigate human rights abuse by American soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think it was Afghanistan, that those individuals will be banned from entering American territory. This is preaching by example. So on one hand, we can have one rule stating that if you commit any atrocities, you have to be held accountable for it. On the other hand, you will say, oh, we are exempt from accountability because we are American. So we decide and we choose, we can pick and choose who is a good guy, who is a bad guy. So nobody else has that power. Only America has that power to choose who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And this is not acceptable. This is not acceptable by any standard. Somebody will say, oh, why don't you condemn the war in Iraq? Why is America not condemning the war elsewhere? For example, there is war in a lot of countries in Africa, right? War that has been supported by American allies like France. France, for example, in America will not condemn the war there because it's in the interest of the West. And this is why some of the conflict that we have in Africa will not feature in any Western news or Western television, because they have an agenda. They decide what goes on TV, and that's exactly the same thing in Ukraine. They decide what goes on Western TV because we have to format people's mind. We have to, construct people's mind in a way that will be beneficial for our position, for our narrative. Unfortunately, there is social media. So social media tell everybody can broadcast what they want. So you cannot block people. How many people watch Western news? But for the little Western news that they watch, it's absolutely shocking what is there. In a so-called democracy, you ban and choose what television, what country should be broadcasting in your land, and that is called democracy. That's a different type of democracy where you choose for people. Yeah, you choose for them. People don't choose for themselves anymore, so you choose for them, and that's meant to be democracy. Okay, we have social media where people can broadcast themselves. They can broadcast all the information that we need to know, and this is the way forward. So you can no longer control people's mindsets. Yes, by doing what you're doing, a lot of people have seen the hypocrisy, and they can tell that what you're telling them is not necessarily the truth. This war has exposed the Western hypocrisy. That's number two. So number one, was that the war has ignited or started the end of the dollar. That's number one. Number two, the war has exposed the biased behavior of the West, the hypocrisy of the Western powers. The third one is that the West can lie. We already know this in the war in Iraq when we were told that the we were told that Iraq had weapon of mass destruction. That was not true. And now we are still living those lies with the war in Ukraine. Whether it's about the what triggered the war, that's number one. Number two, why has the West allowed a coup or sponsored a coup in 2014 in Ukraine? It was a so-called democratically elected president that was deposed. Why? But that was done, and there was no question asked. It was done, and this is why Russia responded by invading Donbass area and Luhansk. Then she continued with Ukraine not respecting the Minsk agreement by continuing to bombard and killing civilians in those areas. But those information, that narrative was never given to us in the Western media. It was never given to us in Western media. Luckily, we had access to the Russian media where we could see what was going on there. So they will not lie anymore. But this is why freedom of information is important, because people have to make their own mind. A video was released the other day about a so-called massacre in Bucha. Right. We've seen in Bucha there was a peace agreement. There was an agreement that was reached on the 29th of March. Is it? Yes, 29th of March. Russian troops left the area. The area was then occupied by pro-Ukrainian troops. There was no news, there was no information about dead civilians. But 5 days after, a narrative was made, a video was made. All of the sudden, bodies were found on streets, in caves, or whatever, claiming that the Russians are actually responsible for the carnage, for the massacre. Well, if there was a massacre there, it would have been done by the Nazi forces from the Ukrainian side, it appears, and investigation by independent investigative journalists has shown that the Russian left the place 5 days before, and there was no body found. Those bodies were not there. How come the bodies appears 5 days after? This is part of the narrative. Whether it's made by the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians are in a propaganda war where they have to paint Russia as the devil, the real devil in this war, in order to get the Western powers supporting them, the Western powers supporting them to act. So this, who benefits from killing civilians? That's the question one has to ask themselves. Who will benefit from these civilians to be killed? Try and have a kind of independent assessment of the situation. Try and have an independent assessment of the situation, and you will realize that yes, there has been a cover up there. There has been what you call a deliberate attempt to mislead the world with this. The information about the killing is not accurate, and that's the truth. Russia has no interest in killing civilians, and those civilians were having white armbands, and those armbands were given to them by the Russians, or they were kind of pro-Russian people, or some way. And why would the Russians kill them, knowing that the West is giving them all sorts of names? Come on, speak your letter, football, okay? Knowing that the Western media have already labeled them as killers, as monsters, as all sorts. Russia has no interest in killing civilians. Not in that way, in a massacre. Not in that way. Yes, Russia has bombed buildings, but those buildings were hit by missiles. Russia is not denying those, but to bring it down to Russia killing civilian, mass killing by Russia, that is false, completely false. So this war has divided the world into two entities, the good and the G7 and the BRICS. China and Russia will be even much more stronger. Now America is supplying the fuel oil, gas to Europe. America's got the market. But guess what? India is going to buy the gas from our Russian government, from the Russian. So India will buy the Russian gas, which is cheap. So the Russian gas will be sold. It will take time to kind of divert it. But it will happen. And who will be suffering? Yeah, because American gas is not cheap. They cannot sell the gas in the same with the same price as the Russian. So European will pay more for gas. Yes, America will make more money that way. But at the same time, America will lose its currency, which is its biggest asset ever. That currency was solid, but it needed something to shake up the planet. And that something was the economic war that was declared by America on Russia. And because of that war, the dollar will start losing its influence in the world. Only poor country will be using the dollars. Poor third world country will be using the dollars or holding trust in dollars. But even then, if they are clever, especially for these African countries that don't have their own currency, now you understand what a currency means. Now you understand what a currency means. So that's it for me today. Leave your opinion in the comment section, and we shall continue the debate tomorrow. Thank you for watching.